Why people fall for misinformation? In 1901, David Honey published a paper that forever changed our understanding of the teeth. Its research with what we know today as taste map, an illustration that divides the tongue into four separate areas. According to this map, receptors of our tip of our tongue capture sweetness, badness and detects at the tongue's base, and along its side, receptor captures salty and sour sensations. Since its invention, the taste map has been published in textbooks and newspapers. The only problem with this map is that it's wrong. In fact, it's not an accurate representation of what Honey originally discovered. The tongue map is a common misconception, something widely believed but largely incorrect. So where do misconceptions like this come from, and what makes a fake fact so easy to believe? It's true that tongue map's journey began with David Hen. As part of this dissertation at Rice University, Headache analyzed taste sensitivities across the tongue for the four basic flavors, using sucrose for sweet, quinine sulfate for bitter, hydrochloric acid for sour, and salt for salty, and applied these stimuli to compare differences in taste threshold across a subject's tongue. He hoped to better understand the physiological mechanisms that affect these four flavors, and his data suggests that sensitivity for each taste did in fact vary across the tongue. The maximum sensation for sweet was located at the tongue's tip. Bitter flavor was stronger at the back, salt was strongest in this area, and sour at the middle of tongue's side. But Henning was careful to note that every sensation could also be tasted across the tongue, and the area they identified offered very small variation in intensity. Like so many misconceptions, the tongue map represents a distortion of its original source. However, the nature of this distortion can vary. Some misconceptions are comprised of disinformation, false information intentionally designed to mislead people. But many misconceptions, including tongue map, central or misinformation, false or misleading information that result from unintentional inaccuracy. Misinformation is most often shaped by mistake and human error, but the specific mistakes that lead to misconception can be surprisingly varied. In the case of tongue map, Hennigel's dissertation was written in German, meaning the paper would only be understood by readers fluent in German and well-versed in Henning's small court of academia. This kicked off a game of telephone that reshaped the tennis research every time it was shared with outside party. Less than a decade after dissertation, newspapers were forcefully insisted that experiments could improve sweetness would improve on the back of the tongue. The second culprit behind the tongue map spread will be images that Henning were inspired. In 1912, a rap version of Mac appeared in a newspaper article that cautiously described some of the mystery behind the taste and smell research. Featuring clearing label across the tongue, the article illustrates simplifying Henning's more complicated original diagrams. Variation of this approachable image became repeatedly cited up without credit or numerous consideration for Henning's work. Eventually, this image spread to textbooks and classrooms as a proportion through of how we experience taste. But perhaps the factor that most contributes to this misconception was its narrative simplicities. In many ways, the map complements our desire for clear stories about the world around us, a quality not always present in the sometimes messy field of science. For example, even the number of tastes we have is more complicated than Henning's words suggest. Woman, also known as savoring, is now considered the fifth-best test, and many still debate the existence of tastes like very, alkaline, metabolic, and water-like. Once we hear a good story, it can be difficult to change how we see that information, even in the face of new evidence. So next time you see a convenience chart or read a surprising anecdote, try to maintain a healthy skepticism because misconception can leave a bitter taste on every part of your tongue. one more. In 1991, David Honey published a paper that forever changes our understanding of taste. His research led to what we know today as the taste map, illustration that divide the tongue into 4 separate areas. According to this map, receptors at the tip of our tongues capture sweetness. Bitterness is detected at the tongue's base, and along the side, receptors capture salty and sour sensations. Since its invention, the taste map has been published in textbooks and newspapers. The only problem with this map is that it's wrong. In fact, it's not even an accurate representation of what Honey originally discovered. The tongue map is a common misconception, something widely believed but largely incorrect. So where did misconception like this come from, and what makes a fake fact so easy to believe? It's true that tongue map's injury begins with David Honey. As part of this dissertation at Leipzig University, Honey analyzed the taste sensitivity across the tongue for the 4 basic flavors, using sucrose for sweet, quinine sulfate for bitter, hydrochloric for sour, and salt for salty. Honey applied this stimuli to compare differences in taste threshold across the subject's tongue. He hoped to better understand the physiological mechanism that affect these 4 flavors, and his data suggests the sensitivity for each taste did in fact vary across the tongue. The maximum sensation for sweet was located at the tongue's tip. Bitter flavor was strongest at the back, salt was strongest in this area, and sour at the middle of tongue side. But Honey was careful to know that every sensation could also be tasted across the tongue, and the area he identified offering very small variation in intensity. Like so many misconceptions, the tongue map represents distortion of this original source. However, the nature of distortion can vary. Some misconceptions are comprised of this information. First, information intentionally designed to mislead people. But many misconceptions, including tongue map, center on misinformation, false or misleading information that result from unintentional inaccuracy. Misinformation is the most often shaped by mistake and human error, but the specific mistakes that lead to misconception can be surprisingly varied. In a case of tongue map, Honey's dissertation was written in German, meaning a paper could only be understood by readers fluent in German and well-versed in Hermes core of academia. This kicked off the dream of telephone that reshaped Honey's research every time it was shared with outside parties. Less than a decade after his dissertation, newspapers were falsely insisting that experiments could prove sweetness was imperceptible on the back of tongue. The second culprit behind the tongue map spread will be images that Honey's work inspired. In 1920, appeared in a newspaper article that correctly described some of the mysteries behind the taste and smell research, featuring clear label across the tongue and article illustrations simplifying Hank's more complicated original diagram. Variation of this approach over image became repeatedly cited, often without credit or numerous consideration for Henning's work. Eventually, this image spread to textbooks and classrooms as a purported truth of how we experience taste. But perhaps the factor that most contributes to this misconception was its narrative simplicities. In many ways, the map complements our desire for a clear story about the world around us, a quality not always present in the sometimes messy field of science. For example, even the number of tastes we have is more complicated than Hannah's word suggests. Umami, also known as savory, is now considered a fruit-based taste, and many still debate the existence of a taste like fatty, alkaline, metabolic, and water-like. Once we hear a good story, it can be difficult to change how we see that information, even in the face of new evidence. So, next time you see a convenience chart or read a surprising anecdote, trying to maintain a healthy skepticism, because misconceptions can leave a bitter taste on every part of your tongue.